This is Perspectives Worthy of Shaping. I am Elizabeth Ngishiri in Nairobi, and I welcome our viewers in Kenya and from across the globe. The program takes an exclusive look at evocative issues in economics, politics, education, and arts and culture. First, a look at stories that made today's headlines. The South African government plan to scrap work experience requirements for first-time job seekers in the public sector has been welcomed by local people of South Africa. New graduates entering the job market will no longer be required to have work experience for entry-level government job, starting from April 2019. The new plan is aimed at tackling youth joblessness. The world has been issued a 12-year ultimatum on climate change. Leading climate scientists paint a dire portrait of years to come if we maintain a carbon emission status quo. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report on the forthcoming impacts of climate change. Greenhouse gases are at levels not seen in the past 5 million years and has seen a 41% rise in the warming effects by various greenhouse gases on the climate since 1990. Our discussion today is, should remote and isolated tribes be forced to conform to modern times? Indigenous communities are a constant threat to life and safety by virtue of their decision to live remotely. These communities are subject to fear of invasion and takeover by the government and other interested parties. For the sake of their livelihood and practices, these communities should be guarded, protected, and revered for their stance on community development, team building, and efforts towards sustaining life in their own condiments. The Sentinelese tribe that killed a man by bow and arrow after trespassing their land can be seen as one of those indigenous communities that need their space and our protection. Knowing the history of African communities and the realization that many of the information and resources that we thrived on have been capitulated from our societies in harsh ways, I bring in today's discussion our indigenous cultures being marginalized by governments for their remote livelihood. Join us on Twitter at Lizzie_M. We would like to hear your views. Today's special edition sheds more light on the topic of the day. Reading from your comments on Twitter, at Therero5 says, Africa should continue to focus on their cultural heritage and art. We were born to create.
The revision of culture here in Nairobi, Kenya is without a constant reminder that we have far moved from the days of our fathers and forefathers grew up in. The change has been closely associated to the economic growth and the potential of the country. In the same light, it is seen as a repeal against the gains of our culture. Without the prior education and facility to understand our root and claim them as our own, the revision of the African mindset is gravely ingrained here in Nairobi that without looking further, it can seem that there is indeed a lost culture within our people. Dependent on Western culture and a consumerist capitalistic view, culture is lost, then forgotten. Speaking to a curator at the National Museum, he tells me more about some of the culture of our historical times in Kenya.
What I think about indigenous communities is I think their history should be documented, and we should be able to know they existed in a way, but we don't necessarily have to adapt all cultures into our modern culture. We can pick the best of everything, like we did with colonization, I guess, but not to the very best. But we can pick different aspects of different communities and really just polish those and dent our community in ways that only every individual person would.
Speaking to our correspondent Abu Bakar, do you think it is important to have our culture back as Africans?
Well, Africa's culture is beautiful. Every culture has a story behind it, even though the potential of this area has not largely been maximized. So walking around to evaluate and see the culture of Africa has been a joy in as far as covering the story is concerned, visiting the National Museum and other areas. that serve as a cultural heritage in the country. But nonetheless, back to you in the studio.
Our discussion today is, should remote and isolated tribes be forced to conform to modern times? Hit us up on Twitter at Lizzie_M and let's continue to have this conversation. Joining us for this lively discussion is Mr. Hesbon Owila.
Thank you for having me.
We are also joined by Derek, the curator from the National Museum of Kenya. And Derek, can you tell us, how does art shape the perspectives of its culture?
Art shaped culture in such a way that you can see that normally for the Maasai tribe, they have the beadworks. They make the beadworks into such beautiful ornaments. Then they sell to the public. But for other people like the youth, the young boys, they normally paint the vehicles. Like they have the matatu, they have the vehicles. They normally put some artwork there to make it look nice. So I think that's how art normally conservative this culture.
And does Kenya celebrate its art and culture the way they should?
In my own opinion, I think it's a celebration because you can find if you go to any museum here in Kenya, there must be an exhibition about the artworks. That's the first thing that we have with every museum. We have the artworks and we have the heritage of the museum. So I think by the exhibition purposes, they have the paintings of the artists, hence they encourage them to do some more paintings. So I think we should embrace the art in this culture.
Mr. Hesbon, should foreign bodies or countries be allowed to interfere with small, remote or indigenous communities? And why do you think so?
Well, in my own opinion, I think all the indigenous communities have a right to practice their culture and do that which works for them. And that is the prerogative of all governments, to just protect the native knowledge and the native cultures. But then on the other hand, I think it's also prudent to look at leveraging on the advances in modernity that make life a lot more comfortable to live, and the conservative nature of some of these local cultures. So it's just a question of creating a balance. To what extent do they remain what they are with their knowledge and their culture, and to what extent do they integrate the new ways of doing things like medicine and the new ways of getting their food prepared and protecting themselves from harsh realities on the environment. I think to that extent you can allow any other entity, foreign countries, the government, NGOs, to help out in that.
And Derek, can you tell us, how does art shape the perspectives of its culture?
Art shaped culture in such a way that you can see that normally for the Maasai tribe, they have the beadworks. They make the beadworks into such beautiful ornaments. Then they sell to the public. But for other people like the youth, the young boys, they normally paint the vehicles. Like they have the matatu, they have the vehicles. They normally put some artwork there to make it look nice. So I think that's how art normally conservative this culture.
And so should we protect this culture's indigenous livelihoods through government and human rights bodies?
Well, I think the first thing with some of these indigenous communities is just to find a way of helping their cultures, and more specifically their languages, develop to the standards of all the other languages and all the other cultures, so that their integration does not necessarily mean that they have to leave what is theirs to be part of the modern society. They can easily bring what is theirs, the nuances of their culture, their language, their artifacts and stuff like that, to just fit into what the other cultures are doing in a modern cultural setup.
Finally, I'd like to find out from you, what are some of the ways these groups can be integrated into society without harming or destroying their culture?
Definitely. Government should essentially protect its people, irrespective of their culture, where they live, how they want to live, so long as they fall within a jurisdiction of a sovereign country. It is the responsibility of the government in that country to protect them. And I think, most governments do that. But I think most importantly, it is also incumbent upon these governments to give enough information to these people that it is not wrong to be who you are, irrespective of which space you occupy. Even if you ascend to the global space, it is just important that you have an identity. I think what we have in Kenya is a very bad precedence, where you find people who can't speak English but are very fluent in Kiswahili and their mother tongues are sent to the global space and they struggle with English. I mean, it's ridiculous. Just speak what you can speak. It's your opportunity to sell that which is yours, you know. I would love to see, our athletes, win marathons and speak in Kiswahili, to develop Kiswahili, because it's an East African lingua franca. So therefore, the government has a role to play, just to sensitize people on the need to have that identity, the East African identity. The Kenyan identity is Kiswahili, even if we have other identities. I think Kiswahili is the one that we can easily sell, and it's incumbent upon the government to encourage people to utilize the spaces that they have to sell our culture.
Thank you, Mr. Hesbon Owila and Derek, for joining us. Now we move on to our social media comments. Thank you all for joining us on Twitter for our live conversation on the importance of culture in our communities in shaping the lives of our generations to come. Reading the last comment.
At BK Turbo Talk says, I think Africans should stay true to their heritage by focusing on what the true African values are in culture and in art.
Your representation of culture gravely matters on the whereabouts of your youth days. The reimbursement of youth cannot be repaid in old age, just like the art and cultures already lost to our forefathers cannot be repaid back in its entirety to us. We must then protect and nurture the ways of others, still using traditional ways in their social, economic, and religious practices. The mandated choice for all of us is not to live in the conformity of standards in the choice of others, but in the truth of our existence. We cannot rejoice in a culture of diversity when we are forced to rethink our growth as cultures and communities without reason. When the world so badly needs it, our creative culture, style, language, and music are stolen right before our eyes, as we run blindly to support vocations that have no benefit for us or our community. The language for the age is on thriving on the beauty of community-based activities with inclusivity rights for all. Thank you for watching. This has been an interesting discussion. I welcome more comments using the Twitter handle @Lizzie_M. Follow us and let us keep the conversation going. I have been your host for this live program. Join us next time on Perspectives Worthy of Shaping.